everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you, and I just wanted to say I see some people I recognize there. Hi, Brian and Amber and Romina, and trying to see if there's anyone else I recognize in here. But it's good to see people, and I feel like I should explain before we get started. I know it looks like I'm in a shed, and that's basically because I am. I built I built a little tiny office in my backyard during the pandemic, and that's where my new office is now, basically, because I'm pretty much almost entirely remote. So that's where I'm at. Um, the thing I wanted to talk to you tonight, though, obviously, is about conflict. And let me get my PowerPoint pulled up here. And so before we jump in, one of the things Geneva asked me to do was kind of just start off with some terminology that we are going to be talking about. And I like that idea a lot. I'm going to steal that for some future trainings that we do. So for those who aren't familiar, we'll be talking a lot about mediation, because that's kind of the heart of where what our practice does. And you can see the definition there. But basically, we get in a room with people and we try to help them resolve disputes, and we're working on helping them become more empowered. And we'll talk more about what that looks like throughout the presentation tonight. Another definition that's important is conflict, and we define that as a crisis in human interaction. And we'll talk a lot more about that, but those crises could be really large, or they could be, relatively small. The same dynamics apply, and that's what's really interesting about this model that we'll talk about tonight. And then transformative is a certain style of mediation, which is the style that we practice here at the center. And it's characterized by being very non-directive, and it focuses on helping parties become more empowered and be able to recognize, where the other is coming from. And finally, we'll talk about intentionally using the terms responding versus reacting. Responding being more of like an intentional response that you develop in response to a conflict situation, versus a reaction, which is more of an unintentional kind of thing. So with that, I don't want to keep talking too much, because our presentations are normally kind of interactive, and I would love to actually hear from some of you. Does anyone have any pet peeves that they're willing to share with the group? And I'm going to take it off share for a second. You could either throw it in the chat or
I'll share something.
I'm sorry?
Diane, I'll share something.
Please, yeah.
Right here. Wait, yeah, I'm on. You see me? Oh,
yeah.
When people don't listen to one another.
Okay.
They just don't listen.
They don't listen, and that's frustrating, I imagine.
That's very frustrating. You see it on the news all the time, and sometimes in your own personal conversations. You hear it in other people's conversation. I mean, it's everywhere. They don't listen. People don't listen to one another. Like, I would hope they would.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
All right, thank you. And then I don't know if you were picking something or if Amber had it, and then I saw Romina too. So either one.
Anyone agree with me?
Yes, I was about to say one of mine really piggybacks well on Diane's, is that when people don't listen because they already know what they're planning to do, and they're engaging in a conversation, but only for the purpose of convincing someone else of their perspective, not to learn what that other person has to add.
Gotcha. And can you talk a little bit more? What's upsetting about that to you? Why does that frustrate you?
Because it feels kind of like there was no purpose in having the conversation. Like, we're not growing together, we're manipulating one another. Gotcha. And so if that's the point, then we could each do something more fun.
Great point. Amber, did you have one too? I wasn't sure.
No, but I'm seeing someone in the chat just wrote, when a hurting person is told all lives matter, this does not seem to show empathy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes when you're having conversations, people just sort of say things that kind of end the conversation. They're kind of like conversation stoppers. Sometimes they're just canned phrases that don't necessarily give a window into what the person is actually feeling. They're just sort of catchphrases.
Gotcha. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you to Jen Smart there too for sharing that. Well, so go ahead. We got one more. Is it Enoch?
Yes. Actually, I'm in Australia at the moment. Um, um, there have been a lot of conflict. I mean, between the indigenous population here and the white settlers here, and we did draw inspiration from the Black Lives Matters movement. But one thing was that is just competing to be the controlling narrative, have been the thing, So what I'm trying to say is, many people that we're communicating with, they're just looking for echo chamber, they're just looking for people that are agreeing with them, and yes, they try to convince others, but actually, are they really trying to convince some others? I mean, there may be some basic psychological need like belonging, self-importance, and other things that need to be addressed. So I'm very interested in about mediation, but also I'm interested about self-reflection and looking deeper in our own resources and ideological biases. How can we somehow not only listen and to others and listen to what is the need of ourselves?
That's awesome, and I'm glad that you're interested in that, because that's something we'll definitely talk about, I think, especially as we get to what we call the relational worldview. So thank you, and thank you all for sharing. I'm realizing we've got a super short training, or I would love to keep asking more, but I'm going to go ahead and go back real quick to this presentation. And, one of the things that I want to do is share with you a story, and I found this in all places on Twitter. Or maybe it was Facebook, but either way, there was a story of someone who basically was calling himself out and being, I think, pretty vulnerable, really, and sharing his own ignorance and his own, really some of his own racism, really, that came through in this interaction that he had with a fellow student. But I want to give you a chance to read, kind of what it was that he was experiencing. And while you're reading, I'll just basically summarize that, there's a guy who's in an early class, and every day he comes in and there's someone who always leaves stuff in his area on his desk. And it annoys him quite a bit. And he, just really just can't, he just can't stand this interaction that he has with this person. And so it's very frustrating to him. And so, it kind of brings out some of the worst in him, to be honest. And I think that if we're honest, that we've all had some experiences like this. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Did somebody say something? Okay. I'm not sure. So I want to make sure though, that, we're not minimizing this. And I want to be clear that, just because somebody thinks a conflict is small or tries to minimize it, that doesn't mean that it's not really an important thing to the person who's experiencing it, and that it's, it can be all consuming. And so it becomes really hard, I think, to try to figure out, how big or small a conflict is. But what's interesting is, to me, that the same principles really apply. And so what I would like you to do, and you can build off of maybe some of the pet peeves you were thinking about earlier, or you could think about a different situation that you've been involved in. But I want you to take a moment and try to think of some kind of conflict story. So it could be a small one, like somebody that you had in a class that just always had their stuff on your side of the desk. Or it could be something really big, maybe from work or in your family, or something like that. But I want you to take a moment, think about that, the conflict that you experienced. And then, when you're at the most difficult moment of that conflict, what was hard about, having this conversation with someone else, And also, more importantly, how did you actually feel when the conflict was at its worst? So take a moment, think about some of those, and then I'm going to ask you just to share really some of the ways that some of how you felt during that conflict. So I'm going to actually give you, maybe 30 seconds or so to kind of think about that. And so I'm not going to try to type this in because I think it's going to become challenging. But if you could, please share with me either in the chat or out loud. How did you feel during those most difficult points in that conversation or that conflict? What are some of the feelings, the emotion words that you experienced? Exactly what you were those words that you're saying there, Enoch. Anger, humiliation, physically threatened, anxious, tense. Adopted son has trouble communicating needs and staying under control. And so how does that make you feel? What are some of those words? Hurt, exactly. Helpless, despite training. Any other words come to mind? Scared, absolutely. So unsure, absolutely. Irritated. And so all of these words really, I think, and I'm going to go ahead and put this back up real quick. All of these words that you're naming are the same words or similar words to what we hear whenever we do this training. And that brings us to the first insight that I want to talk about, which is that conflict is universal. So the experience of conflict, how we go through it, it's not unique to us. It's something that we share in common with everyone. And so that's an important step, because I think it's somewhat empowering knowing that conflict does the same thing to each of us. And so when we talk about conflict, the reason we talk about it as a crisis in human interaction is that there's some way that you're not being able to communicate with the other person that you're in conflict with, and so you have a crisis. That crisis may be as small as not understanding where boundaries are in an 8 a.m. class. Or they may be as big as wanting completely different things in a marriage, or having a boss that you just don't get along with. Those are all examples of conflict. And so what I like to do is show this little clip. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I think it's a funny illustration of what conflict does to us. So let me give it a shot here. Is there a way I can share my sound, the audio as well? Do you know?
Audio should come through.
The audio, okay. Let's give it a shot.
When you hit share screen, there should be an option to optimize video and audio sharing as a little box that you click. It's going to be on the bottom.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I see it now. All right, let's give it a shot.
Come on! Mike, what is your deal, man?
Oh, come on, man. You've been riding me all day.
Mike, you're playing like Betty White out there.
That's not what your girlfriend said.
Baby!
Whoa.
Eat Snickers. Better?
Better. Hey!
That hurt. You're not you when you're hungry. Snickers satisfies.
All right, so I love that commercial because Betty White's awesome, first of all, but also I think it does a good job of kind of explaining what happens to us when we get into conflict. And you know, it doesn't matter how strong we are. Conflict does the same thing to us. It makes us feel one of two things. It makes us feel either weak or self-absorbed, or often usually both. And so, you know, what happened when, you know, when you get hungry, or we talk about getting hangry. I know that I've been there before. You're not at your best self, right? You're not operating at 100%. The same thing happens though when we're in conflict. We become weak and self-absorbed. The weakness comes from this sense of not feeling, you know, like we're empowered to be who we want to be, or act in the way that we want to act, or respond the way that we want to respond. And the self-absorption, that comes from this sense of, you know, we get into this fight, flight, or freeze kind of mode and mentality where we're just trying to survive, right? So we're only worried about ourselves, and we're not really able to think outside of ourselves. And so I just want to check in. Do these make sense? Does this, you know, kind of mesh with your thinking on what happens when you get into conflict?
What I see in the video is, and also what happened is that you're in one situation and something happens that kind of, you know, peeves you off, but then you take it out on someone in that situation, but then you bring in from your own past other issues or prior issues, but you take it out on the person that's in front of you, or the situation that's in front of you. And that's a whole nother, I mean, I just think humans just do that and they don't realize that they do it. That anger just builds. And I think maybe that's what helps build it, when then it can get way out of hand with the situation that you're actually in. But I
Right.
can relate to that fight or flight because that's me. And
Mhm.
I'm usually a flight, a freeze. And it just, that's my own personal pet peeve. And I would just love to not be that way. But I've always been that way.
No, it's hard, right? Because we have to
Yeah.
weigh the risk of, you know, how we're going to be responding, and so yeah, absolutely, that's not an easy place to be in. So thank you for sharing that. Um, so just to go back to this real quick, sorry. Um, when we look at what's happening, it's not enough that conflict kind of puts us into this weakness and self-absorption, right? What also happens is this downward spiral that we get into. So our weakness plays off of our self-absorption and vice versa. And so the more weak we become, the more self-absorbed we become. And then eventually we get into this downward spiral that becomes negative, destructive. We begin to alienate, you know, the other person and demonize them. And that becomes, you know, the situation. And what can happen is, you know, one person could be here or both people could be here, and when both people are here, it becomes really difficult to, you know, try to um, help parties start to communicate again. And so what we see people when they come into the mediation, for example, we're looking for signs of weakness and signs of self-absorption, because we know that those are going to, they're not going to help them, you know, try to deal with the issues that they need to deal with. And so this brings us to the second conflict insight, which is that we can choose to respond effectively to conflict rather than react. And so when I talked earlier about the reaction versus a response, you know, a reaction is kind of what we do automatically, whereas the response is the intentional one. And so we talk a lot about how the fact that, you know, people are able to make what we call shifts. And so when you're weak, you can go to strength. And when you're self-absorbed, you can go towards what we sometimes call compassion. Sometimes we'll call it recognition. We kind of use those terms interchangeably somewhat. But, you know, the strength comes from this idea that you get clear about what it is that you want to have happen. You become more confident and you're a bit more capable of making decisions. And, you know, the compassion part comes from, you know, you stepping out of just thinking only about yourself and starting to think about that other person. And so what we're actually trying to do, and the reason I told you that transformative mediation is kind of unique, is that you know, other styles of mediation kind of focus more on let's get an agreement, whereas we focus more on communication between the parties and let's help improve that. And so what we're doing in the room is often different than what a different style of mediator would actually do, where, if people start to shout, for example, they might, tell them not to, whereas we might start shouting too. So what you believe about conflict really can impact how you actually intervene in trying to help people resolve that. And so when we put all this together, this is what it looks like. People get stuck over here in weakness and self-absorption, and they get into downward spirals. And what we're trying to do when we're in the mediation room with them is we're trying to do interventions that help empower them and help them, be able to recognize where other people are coming from so that they're able to shift over to being strength and, or being strong and responsive. And what happens when people are able to make that shift is we start to see the relationship improve. We start to see it become more positive and constructive. They start to connect with one another and start to humanize each other more. And so, so this is really kind of what we believe about conflict in a nutshell. It doesn't matter whether it's a huge one or a small one, like I was saying earlier. It's still the same dynamics that are present. And so what I wanted to do was kind of look at the example I showed you earlier. And so this is kind of, I want to see if you can spot, where does Thomas kind of shift from being self-absorbed to becoming somewhat compassionate, and what causes him to shift, do you think? And whenever you figure it out, let me know. I can't exactly see people, sorry.
Oh, so this is Romina. I think when he started to recognize that the person was thinking of him,
Yeah,
he felt very differently about the whole, stuff being everywhere.
right, exactly. I mean, and it's little, but it's kind of huge, right? Like it kind of shifts his whole perspective when he realizes that this guy thinks he's his friend. And so what we have real technical terms for that in mediation. We call that new information. So that is some new information for Thomas, and it changes, the way he thinks. And so you can see kind of clearly when he learns something, and then how he shifts kind of from being over in the sometimes we call it in the red, just because we like, when we do these trainings in person, we usually use like a red marker and a blue marker, and it just helps people. But anyways, he starts to shift, right? And so that's kind of what's important. And what we would refer to kind of this process as, I guess, is something we call the relational worldview. And I'm going to do my best to explain it, but I feel like I always kind of fall a little short when it comes to explaining it. So what I would say, though, is Thomas is kind of demonstrating this idea of the relational worldview, which is that it's a belief, or this idea that humans kind of try to act with both compassion and strength. We naturally kind of have these twin desires to be both strong ourselves, kind of our own independence, and we value that, but we also value connections with other people. And we don't like it when either of those things isn't really our reality, right? So we don't like it when we're not ever getting our way, and we don't like it when other people are mad at us, or we're in conflict with them. And so compassionate strength is this idea of staying true to what we believe ourselves, while also being responsive towards other people. And so it's this idea of trying to balance both our own desires and the desires of other people. And so we say, that compassionate strength is kind of like your North Star, really. That's the direction that you want to always be heading in. And it doesn't necessarily, stipulate what exactly that means in every situation, though, right? So it's just this idea that we're going to try to be both strong and responsive in our responses to people. And so if you think about the opposite of either one of those, strength without compassion is selfishness or a bully, basically. And those, we don't tend to look up to those folks. And then, just being completely devoted without being, self-aware or having, any of your own kind of beliefs or anything like that, you're just kind of a pushover, right? And so nobody really wants to be either of those things. We kind of have this idea of wanting to balance compassion and strength. And so this individuality and the connectedness pieces, those two come together, and that's kind of what our goal is. And so I find it's easier to look at a concrete example. So going back to Thomas, right? This is how he responds. Okay, so I'll let you read that. But basically what he's doing is he's recognizing this need to respond with compassion and strength. He realizes he wasn't being who he wanted to be, and he changed his behavior, right? And so, what it actually looks like, though, to me is a really great example of why we call this transformative mediation, right? So in other kinds of mediation, it would have probably been, not that they would have gone to mediation for this, hopefully, but they could have, I guess. But they would have gone to mediation, and the people would have said, okay, you guys clearly have an issue dividing your space. Maybe let's divide it up down the middle. Let's try to come up with some creative solution so that you're both happy. But you would have completely missed the piece of, the friendship portion, right? And so we deal a lot with the emotions more than probably some of the other kinds of mediations are going to be doing. And so, so that's kind of where transformative is a little bit different. I want to pause for a second before we do that. Does anyone have any questions before, because we're about halfway through, and I know we were going to take questions at the end, but I just want to kind of check in and make sure this is making sense.
Yeah, it just seems that Thomas made a decision before he had full information.
Right.
And he was making a decision based upon what he had available. Sometimes you simply have to ask the question, why are you doing this? And it would have solved it the first second.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, how many times do we do that in life, though? Right. And act without knowing the full information.
And also, too, how many times do we not respond from a place of vulnerability and honesty when someone asks why we're doing it, right? Like, he could just say, well, this is where I put my stuff, rather than acknowledging, oh, I was saving this space for you. Maybe you don't want it.
Yeah.
I mean, that could kind of hurt.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and so, the next part, really, everybody always asks is typically, okay, well, that's great, but how do you get there? Right. And so, so I want to actually put that back on you and ask, what are some of your helps? We call it a helps list. Like what typically does help you shift from this place of being, in weakness and self-absorption over to more strength and compassion? And I'm sorry, I'm going to check and see if anybody's putting anything in the chat, because I
will say what helps is definitely what you said. There's been times I've done that. Not maybe exactly as you said, but made a point to go away if it's an ongoing thing and think about what the other person's point of view is.
Absolutely. I think that can be huge, and that can certainly help shift our thinking. What else?
I'd like to ask a question. No one's talking. The woman who spoke after the gentleman said that when we respond or whatever before we have enough information. I missed what she said, but it was really important. I wonder if she could repeat that.
Oh,
Or do you
thank you. I was just saying that sometimes we don't respond from a place of honesty and vulnerability because our feelings could be a little hurt. Like if the guy said, "Why is your stuff here?" The person hearing him might think he's saying like, "I don't want your stuff here," rather than thinking he's saying genuinely, "Why is it here?" You know, keeping that space open for because I'm saving a spot for you.
Thank you. I knew it was important, but I had to ask because I knew it was important, but I missed it. Thank you so much.
Glad you got that. And thank you Ramina, too for some of the things Ramina put in the chat. Choose to spend more time with positive people, self-examine situations, actively choose to consider possibilities other than bad motives. That can be huge. I can sometimes be guilty, I think, of assuming bad motives of people when I know they're just maybe they forgot or something, you know, and I can be really bad at that. So yeah, any others?
So I think sometimes, for me at least, it's about asking myself, why is this bothering me? Like, why is this an issue for me? Because sometimes the issue is not the issue, right? The stuff on the desk was not a problem for his unknown friend. It was an issue for him. So why is that why are these things an issue for me? And then that helps me kind of dismantle sometimes why I'm upset or why I feel I need to like fight about it or and so I think that's a really important piece to be able to step back and consider that. You know, it's just my 2 cents on that.
No, I love that. And I think that there are so many things too, you know, when we get upset, I think of, for me, myself, at least, I think of some road rage I've had before where you look at it and you're like, why am I really upset about maybe 30 seconds longer to get home? That kind of thing. So, yeah.
One of the things, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
One of the things that I try to consciously remember is, what is my end goal? Like, what am I trying to accomplish here? And that's not usually to piss the other person off. And then the other thing is that we are in a relationship. So we're on the same team. It could be my husband, it could be my boss, it could be a coworker, it might be a neighbor. But we are in a relationship. And that's a little more important than whatever is aggravating me at the time, you know?
Right, absolutely.
So that's been really helpful to me. And sometimes I've even voiced that, like, I understand this and that, but anyway, that's all.
Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely.
Your example of road rage is one that does apply. I can recall times my wife and I were driving and she'll ask, why did I respond that way? And I said, well, he cut me off. He's disrespecting me. And she said, no. He just didn't see you was the problem. And so again, sometimes it's one's own perception of the situation that causes the problem, the conflict, not really what's actually happening. So myself, I've got to make sure that I don't kind of imply that somebody's intentionally doing something to me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that kind of goes back to what Ramina was talking about assuming people's intentions, because I certainly can do that too, because it's all about respect, right? And unless they just accidentally didn't see us. And then you feel even worse when you're the person that does it on accident to somebody else. And there's some more in here. Someone asked real quick the style of conflict resolution we do, and that's called transformative. Some other things: try not to get jaded by bad experiences. Sometimes motives really are negative, but maybe not in the next experience. And I think, absolutely, it's important to remember that sometimes people do intend us harm, and that's a different kind of conflict we have to deal with. Seeing the humor in the situation, not taking myself too seriously. I can appreciate that. Humor. And then I think someone had a question about the recording and the PowerPoint. I'll certainly make the PowerPoint available, and I think that the recording is going to be as well. It looks like so.
Arch, I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you find that mediating is different, either more difficult or less in the era of Zoom? Because I find that when I'm able to be in a room with someone and I can see body language more broadly, I'm able to pick up on cues, and I think it kind of softens me a little bit. But sometimes when you just have screens and faces and you can't kind of get the whole context, like I found, for example, our faculty meetings have gotten just a little more tense since we've gone to Zoom. And I think part of it is we're not in a shared space, physical space, that allows us to kind of connect more closely than we can virtually.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think that the impact has been in some ways positive and other ways negative, and you're certainly right about the body language portion, because that's what we train our mediators to do, is to look for body language as clues for what people are experiencing and how we might be able to help them. And so that part's certainly more difficult, especially if we can't even get visual sometimes, you know. And then the tech challenges, the same kinds that we have everywhere, obviously make it more difficult. I will say though, I've found that some people seem more willing to mediate, especially court mandated or court referred cases. They seem more willing to mediate if it's on Zoom because they don't have to come all the way down. And so I think we've seen some increase really in some of our cases, to be honest. So that's a great question. So let me jump back to the presentation real quick, and I wanted to go to the next slide because you all, and I'm going to skip actually because we have, I'm just looking and being aware of the time. I'm going to skip some of these. All right, here we go. And so you mentioned a lot of these really, but I'm just going to kind of, you know, list how we kind of some 5, I guess, possible ways that you can kind of help shift. And so I know someone, I think it was Diane maybe who mentioned this, but just taking time to create some space and help figure out what you want to do, right? So in the heat of the moment, we're typically not going to be at our best unless we've reached some level of Zen that you know, I'll probably never achieve. And so that's an important thing, I think, for most of us, is actually taking that time. Developing strategies that break limited or restricted thinking. And I know some people mentioned things along these lines, you know, but stepping outside of your own head and trying to figure out what are they thinking, or better yet, ask people what are they thinking, because studies have found we're not actually that good at putting ourselves in other people's shoes. We tend to do better when we actually ask them directly what they're thinking. Another thing, you know, seeking input or feedback, especially from trusted others that we value their opinion on. So, you know, that can also be a great strategy and one that I would utilize a lot. Enhancing your personal resources for dealing with conflict. You know, I think maybe it was Romina who said this, but just being around positive people, that enhances your, you know, your personal resources, right? Doing things that help ground you, whether that's exercise. For me, I like, you know, building things, you know, it could be all kinds of stuff, but, and also enhancing your communication skills too, or is another way. And then lastly, you know, especially if you're involved in a conflict that has, you know, kind of big implications, maybe it's something at work, and it could mean the difference between, you know, just a relationship that you have with a team member, or something like that. But, you know, it's probably worth it to actually prepare and rehearse what you want to say and how you want to have the conversation, and maybe try to think ahead of some of the things that they're going to ask you or things that they're going to be upset with about you. And, you know, try to plan on how you're going to respond rather than react in the moment to those things. And so those are all some ideas that we kind of share as kind of possible ways for some, you know, more connection with others. And then the third conflict insight is that, effective communication skills can really help make shifts happen. And so I think sometimes we can feel like Bart Simpson here, where we're just in trouble for how we're communicating with others. And, maybe you say something stupid, or maybe you just weren't thinking, whatever. But there was a misunderstanding, right? And so you you can apply some of the skills that we use in mediation. And so I want to share, these are the tools that we use in mediation. And they're not, I've kind of, we've adapted them to what you can do maybe in the workplace or in your home life. But what we're doing, first of all, is just process observing. We're just looking for signs of conflict. We're probably not going to look at some in a moment. Sorry, I meant to take that out. We're not going to have time for that. Another one, though, is just checking in with people, right? And so we do check-ins all the time during mediations, because we're trying to maybe see how where people are at in a decision-making process, or how they're feeling. And so you can check in with people and just notice that they seemed upset, and actually try to confront the conflict rather than try to hope it goes away. Another skill that we do and practice is active listening. And so active listening is not just kind of passively, hearing what people have to say. You're actually demonstrating to people that you understand what they've said, and you are, listening. We kind of say sometimes you're listening with your whole body, right? So you're showing body language that makes it appear that you've got it, because you do have it. Another thing that we do is reflections. And so this is probably one of the most interesting things. To me, it's the most interesting tool we have. And I was always fascinated when I learned it. But we basically just reflect back what people are saying. And so we do this during mediations. We're not parroting them word for word, but we're kind of giving back to them what they've said to us, or what they've said to the other party. And what that does is a couple things. First, it helps them hear themselves, which is empowering. And so when other people hear you, and you know that they hear you, then you feel more empowered because you've been listened to. But it also helps the other person hear the same thing that other party is saying, but maybe in a different way, because now someone else is saying it. And so maybe now it doesn't sound as crazy, for example, or maybe now they're actually hearing the words that people are saying. Whereas before they were just kind of brushing it off. And so the last thing that we do, though, is summarizing. And so summarizing can be really helpful when you're just trying to help people figure out, what it is that they have really covered. Like I do dissolution mediations, and in that they have to cover a ton of topics. And so I'm taking notes and writing down what it is that they're saying, and then I'm summarizing for them so that they know where they're at on a particular topic. So those are the tools that we use, and those are some of the ways that you can kind of maybe adapt them in your own life. And what we did was we kind of put together a poster, and if somebody wants one of these for their workplace or something, let me know. We can probably figure out a way to get you one. But basically just some early warning signs of workplace conflict. And I'm not going to read them all, but if some of these look familiar to you, or you've seen examples of these in your workplace, then you may have some conflict that you need to deal with. And, we made these based on experiences of our own dealings with conflict. And so some of the services that we provide at the center, we've got one-on-one conflict coaching, where maybe you don't want to come in yet with the other party, but you do want some help in dealing with a conflict, then we'll talk through it with you. Obviously, we have mediation with 2 or more parties. Then conflict management training, which is like this, or we have extended versions of this also. And then we do large group facilitations as well, and something called team building interventions. Excuse me real quick. The team building interventions are basically where we go into organizations and we try to help them figure out what are their communication challenges, what are their main issues, and then we try to help them deal with conflict, particularly conflict that's existed for a while. So those are some of the things that we do at the center. And I wanted to leave you, I guess, with just some kind of some tips on how to, if you do have a conflict in your life that you're wanting to deal with, some things you can consider. And, first is, what's your purpose in dealing with the conflict? You know, I asked this of myself in a conflict that I had that was kind of political in nature with a family member. And I eventually came to realize, that I was trying to convince someone that is never going to change their mind. And so I was kind of left with, what do I really want to do then? Do I want to try to convince them, or do I want to just kind of restore the relationship? And so I realized, one of them was a lost cause. So I just kind of wanted to restore the relationship. And that changed my intention in dealing with that person. And ultimately, it changed how I dealt with them too. And so, that purpose and what you're doing and why you're doing it informs your intention, which informs what your plan is going to be. And so I think that that's important to remember. And then just some last things to consider, first, your own state of mind. If you're going to go into a conflict situation, you want to be, at your best self. So you probably want to figure out things like, have you eaten? Are you tired? But also, are you in the right state of mind? You also want to time it right. You want to consider the other person. What do they prefer? What's their preferred mode of dealing with the conflict? Some people love writing long emails to people and explaining everything. I might be guilty of that. Other people just want to talk it out. Some people like phone conversations. Some prefer face-to-face. That might be difficult these days, but either way, consider the other person. Have the conversation and then follow up afterwards and actually, assess your own, how did you do with your own relational worldview? Were you strong and responsive? Did you behave in the way that you wanted to behave? Just a quick commercial about us. We are actually a part of the city of Dayton, so we're under the Department of Planning, and we do all those services that I mentioned earlier. There's about 10 of us. We have an advisory board as well, and then we've got about 75 active community volunteers, and that's how I started. So right now, most of our mediations are going on over Zoom, and so our volunteers are actually getting onto Zoom and doing many of the mediations, but they do the majority of the mediations for us. These are some of the types of mediations that we do. I'll mention too, especially anytime we go to another city, I like to mention the fact that we were actually helped the city of Indianapolis get a new mediation center started there. So their mediation center is kind of modeled structurally off of mediation center here in Dayton. So if you know people that are interested in your community that might want to start one, then please contact us, because that's something that we also help other centers with. So this is our contact information. And I think that the next slide just has my information. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and would love to take any questions that anybody has. Oh, and actually real quick, I did want to mention, if you're more specifically interested in transformative mediation, a good resource to check out is the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation. They are actually co-located with us at the Mediation Center, but that's the international think tank for our style of mediation. And so they have a lot more, and they actually connect centers internationally. So, so with that, I will go ahead and stop and see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah. I had a question in the chat, and you did a great job talking about what you do in mediating. I'm wondering if you could also give me an idea of the strengths that people have in how they communicate. And I'm specifically thinking of things like the core dimensions, like warmth, empathy, respect, genuineness. And I'm thinking of the difference, say, between Hillary Clinton versus a Bill Clinton, and the fact that one could come across more effectively just because they both can communicate effectively and mediate, but yet one seems to have some personal quality in how they communicate to make it more effective.
So that's a great question that I don't know that I'm qualified to answer because I'm not sure I know much about the what did you call it? The different, what was it, qualities or what?
They're called core dimensions. They go way, way back for decades. I forget who it was who introduced them, but they start with warmth, empathy, respect, and then they go to genuineness. And then the higher ones are really for people who are in therapeutic communication at a higher level, like whether or not you self-disclose, things like that. But I'm specifically thinking of those emotional skills that some people have to be able to connect with other people that some of us do not. And I'm wondering, like I myself try to imitate great models. And I think that Joe Biden is pretty good. And I'm watching him very carefully. And I like Harris now too. I look at people who have power now and who are trying to reach the other side of people who are difficult to communicate with. And I'm looking not only at what they're doing, but how they're doing it. And I'm wondering if you have any role models like that who you think are great communicators and who you might imitate.
Oh wow. I guess for me, so speaking about the model itself, I sometimes talk about people that I guess, have really exemplified this idea of strength and compassion both. And so, when you think about for me, you think about people like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi or Malala, or people who, on the one hand, they definitely have strength of their convictions, right? Nobody questions that they have these strong convictions, and also no one questions that they're committed to this value of human life and connecting with people over finding nonviolent solutions for connecting with people, right? And so those are the kind of the people, I guess, that to me in my mind kind of exemplify the model. But in terms of the core dimensions, there's someone that's on our team that probably has researched that, named Charisse Hairston, and she's really great. And so I'll ask her about that because I don't know enough about the core dimensions thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Were there other questions that anyone had?
Yes, you mentioned in your example with your discussion with a family member about these political topics, and you felt it best to change how you were doing things. Are there times in conflict when it's simply the decision, the right one, to just step away? Something is simply not worth the fight?
I certainly think so, yeah. And we, a lot of times, especially in the longer version of this training, we talk about this idea of kind of ending relationships relationally. And so, I mean, I manage our dissolution program, so it would be hypocritical of me to say no. But we think too on, at the same time that, you can do that in a relational way. And we believe that mediation provides kind of an opportunity to be more strong and responsive because they're actually, it's not a judge that's deciding who gets what. They get to go through and decide who's going to get what their parenting schedule is going to look like, all those kinds of things. And that's empowering. And it also helps them communicate because especially, if they've got kids, then they're not going to be done talking to each other for a long time. Right. And so, so those are, so yeah, to answer your question, I certainly think that, yeah, that can be sometimes the best thing that we can do.
Arch, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how you came to this work. When you went to school and earned your first degree, were you thinking this is what you wanted to do? And if not, how did you find your way here?
Okay, that's a great question. And I'm looking at the time, so I guess I can give you the longer version. So the longer version is that I'm on the Dayton Sister City Committee, and I'll try to shorten this part of it. We went to Bosnia Herzegovina one year, and on that trip were two people who worked at the mediation center, one of whom is now my boss, and another is a really good friend of mine who's now a coworker at the center. And so basically they convinced me, hey, you should really come volunteer for us. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll come check it out. And I kind of got hooked by the model, I guess, that I was just talking about tonight. I found it fascinating because my master's is kind of dealing with conflict, and so I find conflict interesting, and I'd never heard this this theory before. And so I got kind of more interested on it from that angle. But then I started mediating, and eventually about a year later they had a position open up, and I applied and got it. But no, I had no that's the only training. I was not a mediator before. I was a volunteer, and I don't have the only formal training I've gotten has been through the center and then through the institute. So anybody can do it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you explain the institute, that the transformative mediation, and you said it's housed where you are located? Is it more of a training group, and how is it affiliated with the mediation center or not affiliated with the mediation center?
That's a great question. So I should have mentioned that there's a book called The Promise of Mediation, and that book was written by kind of the founders of this style of mediation. And so they were both scholars, and so they kind of felt it was important to start kind of this think tank, because and today, even to this day, the mediation field is kind of dominated by other styles of mediation. Transformative is like a small sliver of that. And so the Institute really tries to do a few things. They kind of try to promote transformative mediation. They try to support practitioners of transformative mediation. They certify people in transformative. And then they do trainings as well. They have a newsletter you can subscribe to and everything. But the person that manages the Institute also works part-time as a contractor, I should say, at the mediation center. And also it's two people that are the Institute in terms of paid staff. And so it's not very big. So they have, their office at the mediation center, and that's where they work. So
Thank you. Also, will this presentation be available online at
I believe so, yeah.
Yes, it's being recorded. We're live on Facebook right now, and it'll be on our YouTube channel as well. And I usually send all the recordings out in our newsletter, so I don't know if you're subscribed to that, but.
Okay, thank you very much.
Were there other questions?
I have one. How does somebody get involved? Like you were saying, you volunteered. How does somebody get involved to volunteer?
It's a great question. If you visit our website, DaytonMediationCenter.org, there is a Get Involved tab, and you can just fill out an application. We honestly have not done a training for new volunteers in a little bit longer than we typically would because of COVID, and we kind of had to shuffle everything. But we may be offering a training here next spring, possibly. I'm not sure about that. If not, probably in the fall. So, but either way, if you go ahead and fill that application, you'll get on our list, and then you'll be able to, we'll notify you whenever when it comes around. And I should say it is, you do have to apply, and you have to go through, and they vet you and everything, and you do some interviews, and but I mean, not to scare anyone away, but it is like a process. So we always really appreciate volunteers that actually go through the trouble of applying. So yeah, but you'd be a great mediator. I'd love it if you checked it out.
Any other questions? Amber? Are you saying you have a question, or are you just clapping?
Either, but
I'm
thank
just
you.
clapping. I think you did a great job, Arch. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I really appreciate the invitation, and it's been great talking with all of you. And you know, I'll put my oh, there's the website there, so you can contact us through there, or you can find my. I'll just throw my email in as well. But thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening.
Bye, Arch. It was good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for coming.
Have you been in touch with Jonathan recently, or you put him on to someone else, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard recently from him, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
I know he said it might be a couple weeks too, so I don't
Sure, yeah, it's the end of the semester here, so
I understand.
take care.
Yep. See ya.